Hello guys, welcome back for the fourth part of my review. This time it's time for the Primal Faction, so let's dive right in. First we have the Cobalt Monument. This card is one of the better monuments, I would probably say maybe second best monument behind the pretty awesome Time Monument. This was a 3/3 flyer for a long time in the closed beta. At some point they upgraded it to a 3/4, which makes it a lot better because now it suddenly can block a lot of stuff. Most flyers are 3/3 or smaller. It also blocks a lot more ground guys without dying. Makes it all in all a pretty good 5-drop for primal decks. Pretty good limited pickup and even a pretty solid constructed card if your deck is looking for monuments. Next card is Blind Storyteller. From Magic we are used to a lot better looters, so no surprise here that this card barely sees any play. Paying 2 is a huge cost for the effect. 1 mana 0/1 also makes the body basically blank, so it doesn't even block the smallest creatures without dying. It just lays around, does nothing if you don't have 2 power to spare to activate it. And unlike in Magic, you can only activate it during your turn. So this card is, in my opinion, pretty bad even in Limited. In Limited it's a bit better than in Constructed because depending on how your deck is going to play out, this might help you win the long game if that's what you're going for. But there should usually be better options anyway. So for Constructed, this card is way too slow and low impact, and in Limited it's usually similar, but it might find its way in your deck in rare occasions if you need something to win the long game and have a very reactive defensive deck and can afford to play this card. But yeah, the card's pretty underpowered. Next we have Cloud Snake Hatchling. Not much to say here. Not a constructed card basically, and also not a good limited card either. It's a bit better than Humbug obviously, since a 1/2 flying for 1 is better than a 1/1 flying for 1, but still doesn't make it a good card. Levitate, another cantrip. This time we get flying for 1 turn instead of +1/+1 to the next weapon or unit we draw, which is pretty decent. Like in Limited, it can be pretty good if you have good infiltrate units to push through, and the same basically applies in Constructed. If you're playing Primal Shadow infiltrate based decks like Haunting Scream, this can be really good at enabling your infiltrators. So all in all, a pretty nice filler role player cantrip type card. Nothing to be excited about in Limited, but nothing to be sad about either to fill your deck out with, because it replaces itself at the cost of 1 power, virtually making your deck a card smaller. Next we have Permafrost. This card is simply great, super efficient. 1 power is as cheap as it gets for removal. Basically stops anything that doesn't have an Aegis or Endurance from doing most or basically everything they do, except from like activated stuff like ultimates. There's no good main deck answers to this other than Silence, which usually cripples the unit it is attached to, at least, since there's no good main deck attachment removal so far. The only thing other than silencing it is the occasional like Praxis Displacer that can return the unit and then you can replay it without the permafrost attached. So yeah, the card is basically a limited and constructed staple. Easy first pick in Limited, and one of the reasons to be primal and constructed, no matter if aggressive or control. Just a great card. Next we have Unstable Form. This card's somewhat interesting. First of all, we get 2 copies, which is definitely nice, so we basically get to upgrade one unit by 2 power cost tiers for 2 mana, or 2 different units by 1, which is nice. And it's also relevant to note that this targets opposing units, which occasionally might be relevant too, like for example if they have a really good unit like a Champion of Chaos that's a 3 power 5/5, you can upgrade it into a 4-drop, and a lot of 4-drops will have way worse stats than a fully enhanced Champion of Chaos, for example. Other than that, there's a bunch of utility units in the game that don't have that much value on their own, like Talia's Favorite and stuff, that this can be nice on. But all in all, the card is a random effect, which is not that nice. As we all know, in games other than Hearthstone, random effects are usually bad and something that you try to avoid. But it can have nice synergies. Card is probably not too great in your limited deck, but might be an interesting card to keep an eye on and experiment with in Constructed. There's also a combo with the 6 power 3/2 flyer that is free if you cast 2 or more spells this turn. So that's a nice way to cheat a 6 power unit into play early and then upgrade it into an 8 power unit, for example, potentially usually getting one of the powerful legendaries, because that's all you get at 8. At 7 there's still a bunch of bad units, but at 8 there's usually only pretty powerful units. So there's that. Worth noting is the fact that the 6 power 3/2 flyer costs 0 in play as well for the turn you played it, so you can only upgrade it next turn. I tried that recently and was quite surprised when it turned into a 1-drop. So that's definitely irrelevant and makes it a lot harder, because your 3/2 flyer has to survive for a turn, which is kind of unfortunate because it's kind of a cute and sweet combo otherwise, but yeah, doesn't work that way. Next we have Yeti Spy, basically a bad card in Limited and Constructed. In Limited you don't even want it as a filler usually, because you basically have to have it on turn 1 and be under play to have a realistic chance to draw the card. But in the right deck it might be an okay filler if you have enough ways to enable the infiltrate, like give it flying and stuff. Then it's at least a 1 mana 1/1 cantrip, which is better than some other cards that are bad and don't replace themselves, for example. Next we have Backlash, pretty efficient counter that stops all the annoying spells and even deals 2 damage in the process. This is a pretty nice role player in Constructed. You will even see some of them main deck in some decks, and it's a sideboard staple for tournaments. And yeah, in Limited I wouldn't mind playing one of these in my deck unless it's super aggressive, because there's a lot of good spells that you can stop from like turning the game in the opponent's favor with this. Next we have Cloud Snake Saddle. This is a really nice limited card, great pickup, +3/+3 for 2 is really good, and since the condition is the unit has to be a flyer, that also means that you give +3/+3 to a flyer if you cast it, which is even more threatening, because then you have a big evasive attacker early on that your opponent has to get rid of quickly before losing to it. The fact that it requires flying should usually be not that big of a deal if you're Primal, even less so if you're Primal Justice, for example, where Justice also provides a bunch of decent flyers. Which also brings me to Constructed. This is not much of a Constructed card, except for like a underpowered Justice Primal flyer aggro deck, basically. Next we have Eastwind Herald, not a Constructed card at all, also not an exciting limited card, but an okay defensive 2-drop if you really need a 2-drop, but more of a filler. unless the flying matters for stuff like Snake's Saddle, for example. Next we have Eileen's Favor, one of the weaker favors in my opinion, but a decent favor for control decks, because it fixes your mana and protects you in the long run against burn spells, for example, and stuff like that, or discard spells. So yeah, pretty decent card for control decks in constructed, but in non-control decks this is usually not very exciting. And I would probably claim similar for limited. The more reactive, more defensive and slow your deck is, the better this card becomes. Next we have Herald's Song. This card is a bit weird in my opinion. Like, to explain the effect briefly, the card is either effectively 2 mana, draw a card, because you cast one copy and discard the other, making it effectively a 2 mana cantrip, or you pay 4 mana and what you get is draw 2, discard 2, which is effectively -1 hand card. So you're either cycling the card, or you're cycling 2 other cards and lose 1 card in the process. And it's also not a fast spell, which makes it even worse, especially given that you have to invest 4 mana to cast both copies. So yeah, I'm not a big fan of the card. There is some niche uses for it if you need to get stuff in the void for Haunting Scream and stuff, where it might be fine. But yeah, all in all, the card is basically either a 2 mana cantrip or card disadvantage. Nothing that I'm too excited to have in my constructed or limited deck. Next we have Lightning Storm. This card is great and constructed for control decks and for sideboards, basically against aggressive swarm decks like Jiddo aggro decks and token decks. And a limited, the card is pretty decent too. I think some people might value it a bit too high and pick it too aggressively. Sorry, I have a bit of a hiccup. But there's still like plenty of stuff that doesn't die to it. But yeah, it's a nice surprise. Can take your opponent can catch your opponent off guard, blow him out. So yeah, it's still a solid to good limited card probably, but there's a lot of better uncommons and even commons that I would pick over this, for example. But yeah, it's still a really good limited pickup, an early pick. Next we have Lightning Strike. This card is a pretty decent primal removal, deals with most of the early and mid-game units, and worth noting, unlike other removal, this is also a weapon removal. So if your opponent attacks something with a weapon, you can just Lightning Strike their face to kill the weapon if the opponent has 4 or less armor, and nothing will happen, which is pretty nice and makes this card more flexible than it seems at first glance compared to other early game removal. So if your deck is a control deck and pretty reactive, keep this card in mind as an alternative to creature only removal, because you might also have to defend yourself against an opposing weapon, especially as a control deck with few creatures where the weapon hits your face repeatedly otherwise. And yeah, in limited, this is a solid card. Once again, gets better the more reactive and defensive your deck is, because in a proactive deck that's mostly interested in removing blockers and attacking, this card is not very good. Next we have Second Sight. This card is once again basically a better version of Herald Song. First of all, because it's a fast spell. Second of all, while it also is basically 2 mana, draw a card. It digs 2 cards deep for the cost of 2 mana, and while you don't discard a card, you just put 1 back, which can be an upside and a downside. It's a downside if the card is kind of bad and you don't want to draw it next turn and rather draw a fresh card next turn. But there's a lot of really nice synergies with echo cards, because you can put one half of an echo card back and make the echo trigger again, or with fate cards like Static Bolt and other fate cards where you can trigger the fate effect again. So this is basically a much better Herald Song, and if I want a cheap card that digs me deeper in my deck and gives me some selection, this is the card I would be looking at in Limited and Constructed. It's a pretty sweet role player that has some nice synergies going on with some mechanics in the game. Next we have Static Bolt. Just a pretty solid removal. First copy is a bit weak at 2 mana, 2 damage at spell speed, no fast spell. But the second copy already gets pretty solid, and the fourth copy is really great, and you can manipulate it with stuff like Second Sight to increase the damage, for example. Maybe even give it Echo to get multiple copies and stuff. It's a solid pickup in Limited, given the fact that it's a common, means that you can potentially end up with 2 or 3 copies in your 45 card draft deck. And even in Constructed, there might be some interesting opportunities with this card. There used to be a pretty sweet like mono primal control combo type deck that played 4 of these, and ways to give it echo, ways to make it cost 0 with the now primal time multicolor Aviosaur. Used to be a primal only card with a different name. Or simply put it back on top with Second Sight to increase the damage of all copies and stuff like that, and use it as a finisher and removal. But yeah, pretty solid Limited card, and for Constructed, currently not that exciting, but might have some interesting applications. It's not a terrible card. Next we have Tundra Explorer. Tundra Explorer is kind of so-so. I would say definitely not a Constructed card. 2 mana, 2/2, no evasion. Mediocre effect is nothing that you're looking for in Constructed, but in Limited this can be a fine 2-drop, especially if you have quite a bunch of spells and ways to make him attack without dying. So yeah, it's a fine filler 2-drop for Limited, I would say. Next we have Violent Gust. Basically at best a sideboard card in Constructed, and the same in Limited, except for the fact that in Limited you don't get the sideboard, so I usually wouldn't want to put this in my deck. I could maybe see playing a copy in my Primal deck if I have various ways of giving units flying, between like Cobalt Acolyte and the flying cantrip and stuff like that. It might be okay to play one, because your opponent occasionally has units that already have flying, and if not, you can give a good unit of your opponent flying and then kill it. So yeah, can be okay in Limited if you have enough ways to make use of it, and in Constructed it's only a sideboard card for specific matchups that currently don't really exist, but might be relevant at some point. If there's a deck with a bunch of good flyers that you really need to deal with, this might be a good sideboard option, especially given that it's also a fast spell. Next we have Whispering Wind. This is a pretty good card in both formats basically. In Constructed this enabled some really interesting pseudo tutor effects, while also being an evasive attacker. Also gets cards in your void. This has been a 2-drop staple in the old Reanimator Infiltrator deck that has since been nerfed, but still has uses in the Haunting Scream deck and potential elsewhere. And in Limited, sorry about that. And in Limited, this is a pretty solid evasive 2-drop that can get you to your high casting cost bombs basically. Alright, next we have Wild Cloud Snake. A pretty nice limited 2-drop, I would say, if you have a lot of flyers in your deck. And in Constructed, once again, only a card for the ominous Primal Justice flyer aggro deck. Other than that, not a card. Next we have Yeti Snowslinger, a decent 2-drop for draft basically if you need a 2-drop. Not exciting though, because 2/2 gets blanked by some of the 2/3 2-drops, most of the 3+ drops, and trades with most 1-drops. But the infiltrate is pretty decent, and there's ways to make it connect in Primal and other colors that you paired with, and you need a fair amount of 2-drops, so this is a fine option if you need 2-drops. Next we have Cobalt Acolyte, clearly not a constructed card normally, but a pretty good limited card in my opinion. At worst it's a 3-power 2/1 flyer. At best it gives your best big unit evasion, or triggers an Aegis, does not trigger an Aegis, gives flying to an opposing unit, so you can kill it with Violent Gust, for example. So yeah, a pretty versatile and decent evasive unit for draft. Pretty good pickup. Next we have Eye of Winter. This card is a bit so-so in my opinion. There's constructed control decks that play it, and in limited it's definitely fine, because having like a recurring stun effect is definitely not bad, but I think 2 power is a huge investment for the effect, and you won't really be able to efficiently use this until like the late mid game or late game in limited usually, and in constructed it's like a very specific card for like control decks to have ways to temporarily deal with annoying creatures until they find removal, then they can kill it and use it on the next unit the opponent draws and stuff. But yeah, all in all the card is a lot of time and power investment for a mediocre effect. So be aware of that. It might seem great at first glance, but the investment is a lot, and it will take a while till you can use it without losing too much tempo. Like in draft I would probably recommend only putting it in like slower decks that will likely have a bunch of spare mana fairly quickly, spare power from the way they work, and need ways to deal with annoying units. Next we have Flash Freeze. This card's basically also not a constructed card, and even in draft I think this is mostly only good in pretty aggressive curve decks, where you try to aggressively curve out and use this to impair their opponent's blockers to finish the game before they stabilize, but in these decks it can be really great. Next we have Ice Sprite. This is a really good limited card in my opinion. Great pickup, potential first pick, I think, in my opinion. It is a bit vulnerable at being a 1/2, but the fact that it has evasion also means that it can often attack for 1 a turn and chip away at the opponent's life total, in addition to being a pretty nice removal and tempo play. And even in constructed this can be decent, but the problem in constructed usually is that it has a bit weak stats for 3 power at 1/2, and is highly unreliable as removal because there is so much removal. You will just use it, try to lock down an opponent's unit, and they kill the sprite, and the unit immediately gets readied. That's part of the problem, because if the sprite dies, the unit immediately is ready to be used again, so you don't even like stun them for 1 turn cycle, if they have an answer. So in constructed, this card's pretty risky. Next we have Icebreaker. This card is once again pretty sure not a constructed playable card, but in limited this can be really nice if you have enough stun effects like Gerald's Frostkin, Flash Freezes and stuff like that. This might be an okay card because it's 3 power and 3 toughness. It's also an okay blocker for small units while it's not being used. So you can try to draft some synergies, like if you already have a couple of stun cards and you see this, you might pick it up to make your stun cards better. But it's nothing to be too excited about, because it's kind of situational and might sit around doing nothing if you don't draw your stun cards. Next we have Mirror Image. This is basically Eternal's clone. Cheaper than in Magic at 3 power, but we all know clone in Magic is not a particularly exciting card for the most part. Same here. In limited, this is, I guess, decent. It's also worth mentioning that unlike clone, this only copies your own unit, which makes it much more situational. I usually don't like to have this in my deck in limited, and in constructed the same basically. At least in constructed there might be some special applications for it, like some combo type interactions that might come up in the future, but for now this card is not constructed playable. Next we have Polymorph, premium removal in limited, definitely a potential first pick, and in constructed still a fine playable removal, a bit expensive, but very cleanly deals with some really annoying units that otherwise would be much more problematic, like Umbran Reaper and stuff like that. So yeah, still good enough for constructed usually, if you have no other good ways to deal with big problematic threats, for example. Next we have Scaly Gruan. Terrible constructed card, and also not a great limited card. It's like a bad filler basically in a slow controlling deck. Next we have Sky Snapper. Pretty nice attack. Add 3 attack for 3 power and flying. The problem is the fact that it has Reckless makes you want to be an aggressive deck to play this, and even then there's a bunch of things that punish this for having only 1 health, like Varus Favor, the Shadow Acolyte that gives -1/-1 and stuff like that. Small early game flyers that trade up with this and stuff. So yeah, the card is a bit risky, but if it works out, 3 attack for 3 power and evasion is pretty nice. Clearly not a constructed card, but can be a solid 3-drop in an aggressive primal based limited deck, since 3 attack evasion is still pretty good even though it's kind of vulnerable. Next we have another 3 power evader in Thunderbird. Once again not a constructed card, but a pretty good limited card at 2/2 flying with Aegis. Makes it pretty hard to deal with, which makes this a pretty reliable evasive attacker and a good weapon carrier. Next we have Wisdom of the Elders, an instant speed version of Divination, which makes it a lot better than Divination in Magic. Also there's very limited options to draw extra cards in this game, which makes it even better. This is usually the go-to card draw spell for control decks in constructed, and in limited it's also a pretty good card, but I would not jam this in any primal deck, only in slower mid-range and control decks, since 3 mana, 3 power for no impact on the board is pretty slow and clunky for some decks, and also just drawing 2 cards is not that big of a gain depending on your deck. So don't just jam this in any deck in limited. There's there's decks that love it, and there's decks where it will be terrible. Next we have Deranged Dinomancer. It's a pretty weird card. Definitely not a constructed card, but it's probably a fine limited card. Same as before. 1 toughness units, especially the more expensive they get, are pretty risky because there's a bunch of cards in the common slot that punish you for it. But at worst, if it survives, this is a 4 power 5/5, or has some nice utility at enhancing your weaker outclassed early game units into 5/5 Dinosaurs, or downgrading opposing bombs into vanilla 5/5s rather than being game breaking legendaries and stuff. So yeah, it's an interesting card to put in a limited deck, I would say, but definitely not an early pick. Next we have Gerald's Frostkin. Again, not really a constructed card, but in my opinion a pretty nice draft card. 4 power 3/3 is decent stats, and the tempo swing that this gives is pretty huge, stunning, the best opposing blocker usually for an entire turn. Gives you a lot of momentum and enables a lot of attacks that otherwise wouldn't be possible, and allows you to push damage through, so your opponent might get too much on the back foot where even their good blockers will just be swarmed and they die through their blockers that would otherwise eat your units. Next we have Rain of Frogs. This is basically the extraction type effect of this game. And yeah, it's about as good as an extraction type effect is in Magic. Basically in Limited, this card is unplayable. In Constructed, this is a very situational, in my opinion, sideboard card against decks that rely on very specific cards. This is also worse than an extraction effect, basically, because you cannot target a specific card unless they have it in their hand. So you either have to know they have it in their hand, or have to hope they have it in their hand. This makes it a bit more flexible than extraction, in the sense that you can just cast it and kind of be a 4 power discard spell, turning one of their good hand cards into a 1/1 frog, and the other future copies into 1/1 frogs as well. So yeah, all in all, for Constructed, very situational, kind of not good at what this card is meant for, extracting a specific card from your opponent's deck, because you can't name a card, you have to take one that they have in their hand, and pretty bad as like an unspecific disruptive element at 4 power with no impact on the board, and they still get a 1/1 frog, and they might not even have something that is worse frogging in their hand, and so on and so forth. I've seen this in some constructed decks, and I think it's just terrible. The card's just really bad. Next we have Serpent Trainer. A premium common and limited, basically. 4 power 2/2 flyer that gets you another 2/2 flyer once you connect, which shouldn't be that hard with a flyer. Is great. In Constructed, this is underpowered. Next we have Soaring Stranger. This used to cost 5 at some point. For 4, this makes it way better, makes it a really nice limited pickup even if you have 0 strangers, because a 4 power 3/3 flyer is usually a pretty good deal. In Constructed, this is basically only relevant if you're looking to make strangers work. Next we have Stormcaller. Once again, a pretty situational constructed card, mostly a sideboard card probably to bring in like controlling decks to punish decks that have a lot of 1 health units. In Limited, this is a pretty solid card, since ping effects are about as good in this game as in MTG. Except for the fact that unlike in Magic, this is not an instant speed ping, you can only ping on your turn. Which makes this a bit worse, and 4 power 0-2 is kind of a meh power to stat ratio. But yeah, it's still a pretty solid limited card. Next we have Yeti Troublemaker, once again a limited only card, bad constructed card, but in limited this is a pretty decent card since card advantage is always good in limited. 3-2 for 4 is probably 1.5 mana power, more expensive than a unit with those stats would be. Maybe 2 mana, let's say, because there's a bunch of mediocre 3-2s for 2, but for paying double the price you also get double the cards, which is pretty nice in limited where you're trading a lot and resources matter, and at a certain point casting cost doesn't matter as much anymore. So it's a pretty solid value card in limited. Next we have Aerial Ace. This card's a bit underwhelming. We basically get a, what's the name, Thunderbird with +1 health for 2 power extra, which makes this a really bad deal. Like, even at 4 power this card wouldn't be exciting. I don't get why it costs 5 power. At 5 power this card's really bad. 2 power extra for 1 health is just a ridiculous deal. I don't get why the card is designed the way it is. It should be a 4 power card and then it would be a solid limited card, and still not a constructed card at all. Now it's not even a particularly good limited card, and weirdly overcosted. Next we have Crystallize. This is really nice. Game breaker in limited. Easily a first pick. If you have a solid board, game is a bit in a standoff, you just cast this and get like 2 free attacks basically out of this. Kill the small units they have. Just a great card. Game winning play. And same in constructed basically. In constructed it's a bit more situational, there's not that many decks that want this type of effect, but if you're looking into ways to keep your opponent from blocking for a turn or two, or punish, have more ways to punish small units, this might be the card for you. Like Elysian midrange usually lives and dies with this card, since that's kind of what makes it win the game at some point. They just kind of stall you out with their big guys, slow down the game, then they just cast Crystallize and kill you. Next we have Elysian Trailblazer. This card is pretty good in both formats. In constructed it's kind of specific, but there's interesting things that you can do with this. This also used to go into the mono primal spell heavy combo control deck that used Channel the Tempest. Sorry for the flicking back and forth, I'm not that good with the card names yet. I remember the pictures and their effect and cost and stuff, but not the names. Will take a little to get used to the names. And yeah, in limited, Trailblazer is a welcome source of card advantage. With an okay body, like 3/3 is usually impactful enough to make the body count, and it gives you a second copy of the next spell you draw basically. Next we have Jotun Hauler. This is a pretty nice limited card, I would say. 4/4 for 5, slightly below the curve, but that's because you also get a free 1 mana 1 damage spell by the time you draw it, which is really nice, especially if you have this in your opening hand. You get to use the snowball early to gain some advantage, kill the opposing 1-drop for example. And this even occasionally sees some play in constructed, because it's a good enough body to stall a lot of smaller units once you play it and be a reasonable threat on an empty board, while also giving you a bit of card advantage and early interaction to deal with annoying early drops like that turn 1 Oni Ronin, for example. So some more controlling mid-rangey decks might be interested in this card. Like I think Icaria Blue sometimes runs 1 to 2 or 4 with their 4 mana tutor to basically give them a free snowball in the process and a 6/4. Next we have Jotun Warrior, the typical 5 power 3/5 that we all know and love from Magic. Not a constructed card and about as good or bad of a limited card here as it is in Magic as well. Not particularly good, but if you really need another reasonably impactful unit and your deck is more defensive than aggressive, this might be an okay unit to help you stabilize. Next we have Magus of the Mist. I would say while this card is a bit vulnerable, it's still a really great limited card. Basically, if the opponent doesn't have an answer for the Magus of the Mist, and stuff like Permafrost doesn't help here, so there's only specific removal that helps dealing with this, like Torch and some of the black removal basically are the only like good ways to deal with this. Then they will quickly lose the game to the 6/6 flying monster, so this is a limited bomb, I would say. In constructed, once again, units that cost a lot and have no impact on the game once they died and are kind of easy to kill are not that great. There's just too many good constructed removal spells that see a lot of play that kill this guy, and then you basically trade 5 mana for 1 mana Torch without getting any effect out of it. So yeah, not a particularly exciting constructed card for that matter. You will just get tempo blown out way too much, way too often. Next we have Primal Incarnation. Again, a pretty good high draft pick, giving you usually like a 3/3 or 4/3 flyer if you're heavy primal by turn 5 when you play it, and scaling pretty good into the late game. So yeah, pretty good limited 5-drop. Next we have Psionic Savant. Again, no constructed card. A bit slow and fragile for draft, but if you have like a more defensive deck and stabilize the game pretty well, you can play this on turn 5 or 6 and start using it to win the game, because this grows out of hand quickly and can make for a decent finisher. But yeah, nothing to be excited about even in limited, but is a fine card to put in your deck if your deck is slow and defensive enough to rely on this. Next we have Skycrack Vivarch. Not a constructed card with those stats and abilities, just too underpowered for constructed, but a premium limited uncommon. 3/3 flying killer for 5 is just great. You get to kill one of the weaker flyers, for example, of your opponent that they might otherwise use to double block the Vivarch to trade with it, and after that you have a 3-power evader that can pound away at them. Really great limited card. Next we have Staff of Stories. Basically a limited and constructed staple. In limited, obviously only if you are a slow controlling deck. Not a card you want to put in your aggro deck, obviously. And in constructed, just a great card. It's basically card advantage and gain 5. Great main deck card for control decks, and a great sideboard card for control decks and mid-range decks basically, and even main deckable in some mid-range decks, I guess. It's even a fine card against decks like Burn out of the sideboard, if you need a way to gain life, because it also gains you 5 life and might help you stabilize once you have stabilized the board to not get burned out by burn spells. Next we have Westwind Herald. Again, not a constructed card. 2/2 flyers for 5 are not good constructed cards, even if they have a nice infiltrate. And the infiltrate is fairly good actually, which makes this a pretty good limited card. The Aegis also makes it a lot less fragile than it seems. You only have to make sure that it actually connects and be able to deal with opposing flyers. But once this connects, you usually get to recast your best removal spell and kill the best unit of your opponent, for example, which is really powerful. So yeah, this is a really good limited card. Next we have Windshaper. Once again, not really a constructed card, except maybe in the ominous Justice Primal flyer aggro deck, and even there it might not be good enough. But in limited, this is a pretty solid card. 2/5 locks down the ground nicely, while your flyers in the air hit even harder. Next we have Celestial Omen. Diabolic Tutor is pretty expensive in this game. We already thought that when Diabolic Tutor became the default tutor effect in Magic for 4 mana, that was expensive, but here we have the Diabolic Tutor effect costs 6, which makes this card barely playable in any format. It's a terrible limited card usually, unless you have a very well turned out control deck with a bomb that you want to be able to tutor for to finish the game once you have stabilized, and this makes it like a virtual second copy, but these decks don't happen that often. And the same goes in constructed. Might be a barely playable one-off in a super slow deck, but it's just like spending your entire Thix turn on doing nothing is just usually not something you're gonna survive. Next we have Hatchery Hunter. This card is usually not what you want to be doing in constructed, because all the cards in your hand will be better than what this does and serve a specific purpose and stuff. But in limited, this is kind of a bomb. 6 power 4/4 is decent stats, and turning the rest of your hand, especially your Axis Sigils, into a bunch of 2 power 3/3 flyers is just brutal and should win you most games. Next we have Joral Iceheart. Basically not a constructed card. 6 power 6/6 is okay stats. The infiltrate is random, unreliable, uncontrollable, and also since he has no evasion, he would need some help to reliably connect. And then you don't even know how much damage you can deal to the opposing board. But yeah, in limited, 6 power 6/6 is already pretty solid, and the effect makes it even better. Even if you deal 2 damage to the opposing board, that still usually should kill something and be pretty nice, and you also probably have drafted things that help this connect with the infiltrate, like stuff that gives flying and unblockable and stuff. So next we have the earlier mentioned Northwind Herald. 6 power 3/2 flying. Free if you have played 2 spells this turn. In constructed, this is basically mostly interesting for the synergies with form, but even there it's problematic because you have to wait a turn till you can actually upgrade it to 7 and to 8, because of it costing 0 in play as well for the turn that you played it. And in draft, yeah, usually your deck won't be able to play 2 spells in one turn early enough for this to be good enough, and casting this for 6 power is a pretty bad deal, so in limited this is usually not a particularly playable card, but can be a filler if really need another unit or another card, since at least it's a 3 power evader, which is better than some other filler options. Next we have Sapphire Dragon. Once again, not a constructed card. A random 6/4 flying overwhelm unit is nothing you want in your constructed deck, but it is a really good limited 6-drop. 6 power, 6 attack, flyer is a really good deal. This card is a premium as limited 6-drop. Keep in mind, it is a 6-drop, so your deck should be mid-rangey enough to make sure that it survives once you drop this guy, and then this guy can just win the game on its own for you if it survives. Next we have Scouting Party. This card is pretty good in limited and probably even better in constructed. This is the heart of the Time Primal Shimmer Pack deck. Incredible card with Shimmer Pack and Obelisk, and yeah, just a powerful card if you can set it up. In limited, it's a bit weaker since a bunch of 1/1s by the time you can cast this might just be blanked by the opposing board. Next we have Thunderstrike Dragon, a limited bomb I would say. 2 6 power 5/5 flyers for one card is just brutal, and usually at least the second should survive and kill the opponent. There's not much that matches it in the air, so it can usually freely attack, and even in constructed this is pretty good because it's very grindy. 5/5 flying for 6 is still pretty good stat to cost ratio, so the echo is almost free. Usually echo units have a lot worse stat to cost ratio than this. This barely suffers from having echo in that regard and makes it really good. This is basically just a great threat in grindier matchups. Gives control decks that have to answer threats 1-for-1 a headache. Pretty powerful card even for constructed. If your deck needs a way to like overload opposing removal, might be an interesting sideboard option against control decks, for example in a mid-range deck. Next we have Aractodon, terrible constructed card, not great in limited either, but 5/6 overwhelm usually outclasses most of what your opponent is doing, so at least if you get to play it, it can kind of dominate the ground. But yeah, 7 power for 5/6 is not great, and 7 power already is a lot anyway in limited, so try to not put this in your deck. Next we have Mistveil Drake, another kind of limited bomb. Usually turns out to be a 6/6 flying Aegis for 7 that has given you Aegis at some point, which is really nice. It's a bit unreliable in the sense that sometimes your Aegis gets popped before you get to play this, then it's only a 3/3, which is pretty underwhelming. But then again, there's not that many things that break Aegis on players, especially in limited, like the opponent won't cast burn at your face unless the burn is going to kill you anyway, so they usually won't break your Aegis just for the sake of breaking your Aegis. But keep in mind, they see the fate effect, so they know you have it in hand, so the opponent might proactively torch your face, for example, to break the Aegis before you can play this as a 6/6. So it's a bit unreliable, but potentially really powerful. Not the greatest constructed card, but a pretty good limited card, I would say. Next we have Rhymescale Draconis. Not the best constructed card, but can be maybe interesting in constructed, since after your opponent like attacked you with his units, you get to just play your 7th power, play this guy and keep everything locked down. And yeah, in limited this is just a brutal bomb that should usually win you the game. Next we have Strength of the Pack. Once again, not a constructed card in my opinion, but once again a limited bomb that should usually win you the game. You enhance your best unit and get a second enhanced version of it. If that doesn't win you the game, I don't know what does. Problem is, it costs 3 primal influence and 7 power, and you need a decent unit in play. But if these criteria are fulfilled, this should usually mean you win the game. Next we have Channel the Tempest. 4 primal influence, so this requires you to be heavy primal influence, and is pretty expensive, but should usually lock up the game. This is a really nice pickup as a win condition for like a control draft deck, and a potential interesting build around card in Constructed that currently has no real use, but might find a home again in the future. Like I said, there used to be a mono primal Channel the Tempest deck at some point in beta, which did some interesting things, for example. Next we have the obligatory 8 power legendary of each faction. This time we have Eileen, Queen of the Wilds. 6/6 flying for 8 is pretty decent, and it basically makes every spell that you play give you another random spell from your deck, which is pretty nice card advantage. In Constructed, this is usually, like most of the 8 power legendaries, not what you are looking for to do at 8 power, but in Limited, once again, a game-winning bomb if you get to that point. The problem only is by the time you cast this, you probably won't have spells left in your hand, so that effect won't be that impactful, but a 6/6 flyer is already a pretty good win condition, so it's a decent limited card for a control deck that needs a finisher. But don't be too excited about this. It's worse than it looks, I would say. And last but not least, we have Scourge of Frostholm. 10 power is like the most expensive, I think, actual power cost in the game. There's cards like Witching Hour, which cost 24, but that's not the actual cost that you cast them at. I think there's no other card that I can think of right now that costs 10 or more that you actually have to cast for 10. It's an 8/8, no evasion, not exciting, but it prevents your opponent from playing any spells and fast spells, basically. I think the way it works in this game is that can't play spells means literally things that say spell on it, like spells and fast spells. You still can play units and weapons and sigils and relics and curses and stuff. Yeah, this is mostly interesting for reanimating it early for cheap to lock the opponent out of dealing with it and executing their game plan. Other than that, if you can't cheat it and play in Constructed, this card is basically unplayable. It's 10 power is even too expensive for a finisher in Limited, and playing it fair and square in Constructed is also not gonna happen. So yeah, that concludes my review of the Primal Faction. I hope you enjoyed this once again. As usual, let me know in the comments what you think, if you agree and where you disagree with my assessments, and if you liked the video, please drop a like so the video gets suggested, gets recommended to more people, and subscribe if you like what I'm doing, and be informed about future videos. Alright, thanks for watching. See you next time with the Shadow Faction. Bye!